Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is detect. Let's take a moment to look at some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear detect used is to mean to discover or become aware of the presence or the existence of something. With this first definition, maybe think about being at your desk, studying, working, right? And you might hear some noises and realize, oh, someone's behind me, right? You're becoming aware of their presence or their existence. A second and related thing is our second definition here to perceive or recognize something that is barely perceptible. Right? So, with this second definition, my mind many times goes to food. So you might think about someone else is cooking or making something, and is that cinnamon? Right? Is there like a certain spice that I can just barely start to recognize? A third way you'll hear the verb detect used is to mean to discover or investigate a crime or the person who committed it, who did the crime. Okay. So now that we understand this verb, I want everyone to know that detect is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing to form detecting. The past tense and participle forms of this verb can be made by just adding ed. Our base verb, detect, ends in a T sound. And this means that when I add that past tense ending, I'm going to add an extra syllable, and the sound I'm going to make is id, id. So it should sound like this: detected, detected. Okay. Now, there's one phrasal verb that you might encounter, and that's to detect something in something else. So, what you're going to notice with this phrasal verb is that the verb and the particle are always separated. And you can see that this phrasal verb has a very similar meaning to one we've already discussed. So, becoming aware of the presence of something. Right? And it might be that we're becoming aware because we tried to mask or hide something. Or perhaps there's just a very small amount or a small quantity of that thing. So I've got two example sentences to help us see how this phrasal verb gets used. They're both questions. The first is, do I detect molasses in this cookie? Okay. I took that example from something that happened recently. My husband and I had purchased some cookies. We were enjoying them, and after a bite or two, he was like, something's a little different about this. Is there?" And he started naming different things, and I looked at the ingredients. Right, there was molasses, and he was like, "Ah, that's it. That's the flavor I'm noticing." Okay. A second example, do you detect anger in this message? Right? So it might not just be kind of smells or the presence of something. It can be intangible things, right? Things we can't see. So here we're talking about this emotion. So we might be sort of reading between the lines to see that the writer here is upset or angry about something. Let's continue using our verb of the day now in a couple different verb tenses. We're going to discuss the past perfect and the present perfect progressive. Let's start with the past perfect. We use this verb tense to note that we have a completed action in the past, but what makes it a little different than the simple past tense is we're trying to note this action occurred before some other action or before a certain period of time. To make the past perfect, I need two parts to my verb. I'm going to use the past form of have, which is had, and then I'm going to use the participle form of the verb. Let's take a look at an affirmative example. The government had detected spy drones weeks before it was reported in the media. Okay, so here we're going back to that noticing the presence of something. So here, kind of spy drones is our topic. And again, the use of past perfect is to note that this action occurred before. another action, which is the reporting of this information. Now let's look at a negative past perfect sentence. Our structure is very similar. We always start with our subject, but then we're going to use had not and then the participle. You might also hear or see the contraction hadn't used. An example of this: health officials hadn't detected the virus in the sewers before the outbreak in the city. This is kind of an unpleasant thing to think about, but it does happen a lot where our sewer waters are monitored for the existence of certain viruses. This was done during the pandemic a lot to notice if there were high levels of COVID, for example. So here, though, we're noticing that whatever virus is being discussed here had not been perceived. People were not aware of it prior to this outbreak. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the past perfect. To do this, I start with had, then I have my subject, and then the participle form of the verb. Here's an example. Had you detected that he was unhappy before he announced that he was quitting? Again, I'm using past perfect here to note that I'm wondering about a particular action prior to another one. So I want to know, did you notice this person was unhappy before they announced they were quitting? Now let's move on and talk about the present perfect progressive. We use this verb tense many times to stress how long an action has been continuing. So we're talking about something that started in the past and is still ongoing. Okay? To make the present perfect progressive, you might notice the three P's there in the name. I like to remind my students, three P's, that means I need three parts to my verb. Okay? In this verb tense, I need to pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I, you, we, or they, I'm going to use have, then the participle been, and then the ing form of the verb. But if my subject is he, she, or it, I'm going to use has, then been, and then the ing form of the verb. So that's the thing we have to watch there a little bit. Are we using have or has based on our subject? Now, I also should note that some teachers and some textbooks call this the present perfect continuous. That's fine. It means the exact same thing. I, again, like using the P's to help my students remember how many parts we need to form the verb. So now that we know a little bit about that, let's look at some examples in the affirmative. The software has been detecting several potential viruses. So maybe we're talking about this today, this week, but for some reason, right, our software keeps detecting threats or malware, might be another word you hear. Now let's look at negative present perfect progressive. Again, I start with my subject, and then depending on what it is, I use have or has, followed by not, then the participle been, and then the ing form of the verb. Here's another example. We haven't been detecting any growth as we've monitored you in the last 5 years. This is a sentence I think many people who've experienced cancer are excited to hear, right? So different tests are done to see if there are other cancerous growth, cancerous tumors. Might depend on the type of disease here, but this would be great news, right? We can't tell, we can't perceive any other signs of cancer in your body over the last 5 years, right? So there's that going, starting in the past and continuing into now. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect progressive. To do this, I start with have or has, then I have my subject, then the participle been, and then the ing form of the verb. My last example is, have you been detecting any unusual flavors in this dish? Maybe I've experimented with something, right? And I'm kind of wondering, can you perceive something that maybe is in small quantities? Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb detect. And the first word we're going to discuss is the noun detection. This is just the action or process of identifying the presence of something, maybe again that's hidden, or maybe it's just in a small quantity. So, an example of how you might hear this used: early detection of cancer saves lives, right? So, if we can identify the presence of cancer, the chances that we are going to be able to treat it and survive it increase greatly. Another related word you might hear is the noun detective. This is a person whose occupation it is to investigate and solve crimes. So this noun is tying back to that third definition of the verb we discussed a little bit earlier today. An example of this in a sentence might be: detectives are interviewing witnesses to the crime. Right? So trying to understand what people saw, what they noticed, maybe understanding the process of events. Another related word you might hear is the adjective detectable. And I always encourage my students, when you see that suffix able, think able to, and then look at your root word. So here, able to be detected, discovered, identified, perceived, noticed, all of those things are going to connect here. An example of this adjective in a sentence might be: no detectable chemicals were found in the lake. So perhaps there was a concern, a worry, something had spilled into this particular body of water. They test it and they're not able to discover, identify, or notice any chemicals. The last word we're going to discuss today is another adjective. You're going to notice I've added the prefix un, which means not. So undetectable just means we are not able to detect, discover, identify, perceive, or notice something. An example of this might be: carbon monoxide is undetectable to human senses, and this makes it deadly. So carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas, right? So I can't see it, I can't smell it, and that is what can make it so deadly, right? So many people have monitors in their home so that, right, something starts to beep in case that poisonous chemical is discovered. And then we know we need to open windows, do something to correct that problem. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.